My name is Jose Gomez, and I'm an MBA student here at Anderson. So in recent years, the renewable energy sector has expanded tremendously in Latin America through significant direct foreign investment and public-private sector collaboration. To transition from a region known primarily for its vast oil reserves to one with a renewed focus on clean technologies, Latin America will need the support and cooperation from other nations, including the United States. Our speakers will address the current state of the clean energy industry, the relationship between the US and Latin America, as well as its importance to the region's path towards sustainable growth. Our distinguished speakers on this panel are Carlos Barrera, Chief Executive Officer of Atlas Renewable Energy and former Managing Director for Latin America for SunEdison, who has also worked in a variety of executive roles with BP. Lee Bailey, Chairman of the Board for SolarReserve and Managing Director of Ascent Holdings, and Lee Bailey is an influential investor in renewable and clean energy-based companies. BRYAN Early, Special Advisor to Commissioner McAllister, and Lead Advisor to Chair Weisenmiller on Mexico-California issues at the California Energy Commission. And he works on effectuating California's goal to doubling energy efficiency savings by 2030, and on the implementation of the Energy Memorandums of Understanding signed with Mexico in 2014. The panel will be moderated by UCLA Anderson alumna NURIT KATZ, Chief Sustainability Officer at UCLA, who works to foster partnerships among academic, research, and operational departments to facilitate creating a world-class living laboratory for sustainability at UCLA. Please join me in welcoming NURIT KATZ and our distinguished speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really exciting to see a panel on this topic included in the Latin American Business Conference this year. So to start with, let's have you guys just introduce yourselves a little bit more and the nature of your work. Lee?
My name is Lee Bailey. I was formerly with, and still am, a company called US Renewables Group, which is a private equity fund. We raised about $1 billion. And what I do is I invest in companies that develop projects: wind, hydro, solar, geothermal, biomass on the power side, and on the fuel side, biofuels, waste, ethanol, bioenergy. And our fund has invested in over 23 companies that develop projects. A number of those companies are investing in the Latin American region. We as a fund will often invest equity in a project. So think of me as a guy who invests in companies that develop projects, and then if I like the project and I think it's got a good return, I'll put money into it.
Great, thank you. Carlos?
As you explained, I'm the Chief Executive for Atlas Renewable Energy. Atlas is the second largest solar company in Latin America. So with our constructions that are currently underway, we will become, I should say, the second largest company in Latin America that sells solar. Our business model is basically to develop large projects. We originate them, develop them, finance them, build them, and then operate them and sell clean energy to different clients. We're owned by Actis, another private equity, very prominent in the sector. They're probably one of the largest emerging market energy sector investors. And so we're part of their Fund 4. This is the fourth energy fund that they've raised. From them, we have about $650 million. We used to have 525, it was increased actually to 650 of equity to invest. So we'll basically aggregate an enterprise value of about $3 billion over the next sort of 3-4 years.
Thank you. And BRYAN, all these guys have to work in a regulatory context. Tell us what you do in the public sector.
Of course. So my name is BRYAN Early. I work for the California Energy Commission. The California Energy Commission was founded in the 70s, actually during the first reign of Governor Jerry Brown, back when he was the youngest governor in California history. He's now, of course, the oldest. And it was founded back in the 70s to challenge the utilities who were planning on basically building nuclear power plants all along the California coast. And there was a revolt amongst California voters to that spectacle. And so the California Energy Commission was founded really primarily around the idea of energy efficiency And so we started promulgating building standards and appliance standards. So every 3 years we update the building codes for the state of California. The proposed 2019 building standard, for example, will require rooftop solar to be on all new single-family residential structures. We recently just passed the first in the nation, actually really first in the world, standards on computers and monitors. So in addition to energy efficiency, we regulate and certify large thermal power plants in the state of California. We have a transportation arm. We co-administer the state's renewable portfolio standard. And we have an R&D division, so we help bring new technologies to the market. So we were founded in the 70s all about energy conservation, and we've transitioned now to being all about climate change. And so Governor Jerry Brown, with his founding of the Under 2 MOU, where he encourages other subnational entities to commit to policies to ensure that the world does not go above 2 degrees Celsius warming. And so that's where our work with Mexico comes in. Mexico, of course, is one of our most trusted partners. We share a border, we share the same air, and Latin America in general, is incredibly important to this administration.
Great, thanks. So this first question is to all of you, or any of you who would like to answer. Latin America is currently poised as a leader in this space, 53% generation capacity from renewables now. In fact, in 2016, Costa Rica ran purely on renewable power for months at a time. Uruguay is generating 92.8% of its electricity from renewables. So it's a really exciting time. But I think there's a question of whether Latin America is ready for a full technological transformation. And do you think that we'll continue to lead or be a leader or follower? Where do you think the industry is going? It's a big question.
You want to start?
Sure, I'll start. I think there's a couple of things that, a couple of perspectives that may be interesting here. First is, why is the region interesting for renewables? And then I'll talk maybe a bit about what the driver, I think, has become now for renewables rather than what it was originally. So there's the conditions for renewables in Latin America are kind of unique. So first you have this fantastic resource. So if you look at, Brazil, Mexico for wind, it has excellent capacity factors. If you look at solar, certainly in those two markets, it's not bad, but if you look at Chile, Peru, you have very high capacity factor as well. So the resource base for renewables, I think, is very strong. Second, you have a huge energy demand that's growing. Every year there's, I think, about 11 gigawatts or something of new demand overall in Latin America. Obviously, the biggest is, Mexico, Brazil. But overall, it's a pretty significant growth year on year. And then you have a constituency that wants renewables. So if you look at pretty much every single country where you have penetration, people don't want coal plants, people are reticent to gas plants even, whereas they're very friendly towards renewable energy, and they want that. They want that from their politicians. So that's really enabled a lot of investment in this sector. Initially, it was, I think, much more politically motivated, much more around climate change. And I think in the last 6 years, what's happened is that has shifted. So I think the costs have come down to such level for these technologies that the driver has now become commercial. So people have seen a drop in PV panel prices, which used to be about sort of $3 a watt, and the panels used to be 200-watt panels. Maybe this was 5-6 years ago. Now it's 30 cents a watt, and it's 400-watt panels, right? So you've had this dramatic reduction in cost. And now all the governments, if you look at Mexico, Chile, Brazil, that hold these very large auctions where they award long-term power contracts, the pricing that they're getting now is a fifth, a seventh of what they used to get 5-7 years ago when they were contracting with coal and other sources. So I think that's been one of the key drivers for the region.
It really is price-driven because only in the U.S. do you have natural gas supplies like we are experiencing, not almost any place in Latin America, very little coal, very little nuclear, and so the price of building that kind of infrastructure is really kind of prohibitive and not very attractive when you can get much less expensive alternatives that are currently available. And the price has gone down just dramatically, such that, and again, this used to be a technology sort of play. It's not. It's just pure infrastructure. And that's as wind and solar and hydro. It is pure infrastructure. Nothing fancy about it, nothing risky.
So it definitely sounds like a lot of good resources, a lot that's driving this. You know, part of what's made California a leader in this area are government incentives, actually, and regulation, which Bryan alluded to in terms of the CEC and their history. How is the relationship between Latin American governments and the industry? Are there incentives in place? And what sort of incentives, if any, should Latin American countries be adopting to boost growth?
Well, there are some incentives. It depends. It's country by country. Mexico has some. They're not all that attractive. You really have to have taxable income to take advantage of some of them. Debt isn't very attractive to do in Mexico, but there are incentives. There are tax incentives and there are green certificate incentives, but nothing quite comes up to the level of incentives that we've experienced in the U.S. with the cash grant program, some of the other ITCs that are available in the wind and solar industry.
Yeah. And Bryan, what are you finding in your work with Mexico around these areas, and how do those incentives compare, do you see?
Yeah, well, so I mean, in California, we obviously operate with both carrots and sticks, you know, so we do have a lot of incentive programs directed at various technologies. We have straight up mandates on the utilities to procure renewable energy. And then we have the overall economy-wide cap on carbon emissions, which the major utilities have to participate in. And so, you know, a lot of our work with Mexico, we don't necessarily try to replicate exactly the California sort of example, since we do a lot of things well, then there's a lot of things that are happening right now in the California regulatory sphere, which I really would not wish upon any other country. But a lot of what we you know, have done well and are setting up, for example, the way that our wholesale markets operate, we're working with Mexico to try to you know, ensure that you know, least cost resources and renewables are integrated in a most least cost manner. And so there certainly is a lot of opportunity for sharing of knowledge there, but then also R&D funding is just incredibly important. And as you think about economies that ideally, you know, will have higher growth rates, more construction, more things being purchased than in California, a lot of the R&D that's happening in California research institutions, which is then being mandated by California government, if we can replicate that model and sync up research institutions in California with those in Mexico and those in Latin America, we can really go a long way to planting the seed of decarbonization within this economic growth, which we are running after.
So, I mean, I really think that's important, a really important point, what Bryan is saying. So let me try to elaborate. What Lee said is exactly right. So yes, there are some incentives, but it is absolutely not the driver of business and investments in the sector. It's just not. It used to be, again, several years ago. Nowadays, you have private clients, mining companies, large retailers. This is happening in Chile. This is happening in Brazil. It's happening in Mexico. They are contracting directly with energy from renewable sources. So it's not about the incentives anymore. I think the regulated markets, so distribution companies, et cetera, also want more renewable energy. I think the constituency also wants, you know, deployment of renewable energy rather than coal. And so you have in the regulated market, you know, quotas and things because people, you know, are getting the benefit, I think, of lower price and want to see more deployment of that. But the driver, I don't think, is about the incentive. However, I think one of the limiting factors is, you know, the whole grid infrastructure side. And that's where investments in R&D, as Bryan is saying, and I think, you know, the California Commission, I think, has been a leader in that sense, at least in this part of in this hemisphere, rather. I think that's what's really maybe lacking in Latin America. So to answer maybe your initial question, I think you'll see a lot more investments, a lot more infrastructure investments in renewables in LATAM all over. And the limiting factor will be that. So to the extent that independent grid operators start investing in grid, it'll just keep going and going, I think, for the next 5-10 years.
Another irony quickly is that when you're underwriting a project, if it's loaded up with a whole bunch of government givings, that generally tends to send the private equity investor away from the project. So what is nice about Latin America is in many cases you've got a privatized, market-driven price without a lot of government gimmies, so it makes it a lot easier to underwrite.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, as we're looking across the region, this past year was a major year in Latin America. Argentina's president issued a decree to significantly develop his country's renewable energy sector within the year. Google Chile announced it now gets 100% of its electricity from renewable energy, 776,000 solar panels installed across the Atacama Desert. Brazil essentially, runs a lot on hydropower, is now exploring wind and solar. So a lot of things happening throughout the region. What do you see as some of the big differences? Are there certain countries that are leading the transformation? And more importantly, do you find that there's an environment of cooperation among the countries, or is it more competitive? Anyone can take that one.
There are some regional cooperative, so there's a transmission line that goes from Mexico all the way down through Central America. So yeah, there's some abilities there to integrate. Most of the other countries, I don't think there's a whole lot of cooperation, but it doesn't really matter. The in-country, it's really a function of the marginal price of electricity, the resource, and what is the demand, and that really does determine pretty much where you go. It's credit quality of the country and the quality of the off-taker, and those are really what drive investments in the region. The countries that you just mentioned, Mexico. What's interesting, 4 years ago, you couldn't get anyone to go on an airplane to Argentina because it was absolutely unfinanceable because they defaulted on their debt. Fast forward this year, and it's a land rush into Argentina to take advantage of, the new government has set forth a number of incentives, and it's a land office business. So it really depends upon the government, the credit quality, the off-taker, the marginal price of electricity, and the cost of capital.
Yeah, I agree. I think the integration question, I think there's a lot of talk about it. I think in Central America there's a bit more advance in it, but it's not really the driver. It's just not I think doesn't really have an effect on investments. It's not having one, at least to date. In terms of differences, there's massive differences between the markets. It's very, very different markets. What Sebastian was saying this morning, if you go to Brazil and you want to set up an SPV, it takes 6 months. If you go to a different market like Chile, it's a lot more business friendly. So I think it's very different. Brazil's a lot more protectionist in that sense. The Mexican market, I think, is quite complex. The Uruguayan market's very simple. The Peruvian market's also quite simple. So every market certainly has its flavor. Every regulation is quite different. Financing, I think, for us is fundamental. And so depending on which markets you're in, you get certain types of financing or other types of financing. So it is very different. So I think you need to have a kind of an in-depth understanding of the country you're in if you want to be able to thrive. And
are you seeing any cooperations or partnerships among these areas? Brian, it sounded like you were about to say something.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of integration, as we move towards higher and higher penetrations of renewables, the geographic scale of your energy market becomes very important. So in California, CAISO, our grid operator, has an energy imbalance market, and they have ambitions, if the California legislature will allow them, to expand to become a regional independent system operator. And actually, we share a grid with Baja California, and so the idea being that we can shift resources. So if the sun isn't shining here, it may be shining somewhere else. Wyoming wind can help bridge times of the day when the sun is not shining, obviously. And in terms of stability is very important, and congruity between administrations. And so California, we've been lucky in that our climate policies were originally voted and they were signed by a Republican governor, Governor Schwarzenegger, upheld by Governor Brown. I think we're going to have ongoing support. And so this is very, very important to the capital markets in terms of being able to finance these projects cheaply. And then, different countries will have, some countries in Latin America, for example, are requiring local content requirements. And that's certainly an option if you're trying to drive up, local tech. But these are global markets, and so that will increase cost.
Thanks. And you alluded to kind of continuity or lack thereof sometimes with administrations. Latin America is a region that's often known for kind of boom-bust economic and geopolitical cycles. You guys already alluded to that a little bit. Lee, how do you incorporate this volatility into your investment decisions? What steps do you take to reduce the risk associated with that volatility?
Well, the underwriting is relatively straightforward. You know, how stable is the currency? You can figure that out. You know, have they maintained good credit ratings? And that's figure outable. Who's the off-taker? If it's a utility or it's a private entity, what's their credit quality? Have they defaulted in the last 20 or 30 years? And you know, very quickly you can sort of figure out if it's investable or not. And then you got to go figure out who are going to be your partners. And I can't underestimate the need for local partners, both at the equity and the debt level, because otherwise it's probably not going to be a very good experience.
Thanks. Carlos, over a year ago, Actis Capital, a leading growth markets investor, announced a commitment to invest $525 million in establishing a pan-Latin American renewable energy platform, speaking of partnerships. Under your leadership, Atlas Renewable Energy was the main driver of this expressive investment. Can you share the current stage of the project, major challenges, any future goals for this endeavor?
Sure, yeah, sure. So I think we had a rocky start, right? Before we started, this same team was part of the SunEdison team, right? SunEdison was, at the time, a very successful company, many years ago, I would say, and then started growing more than it should have and entered into problems. And so unfortunately, that business ended. Our team in Latin America, we had arrived 5 years before or so, and we were, I would say, one of the pioneers for solar in the region. So when we arrived, I think the largest project was 1 megawatt. We signed, you know, some large transactions immediately, and basically started bringing 100 megawatt projects, you know, 150 megawatt projects to the region, and really kind of developed even some of the regulation with different governments that we participated with. So that was kind of the beginning, right? Halfway through that ended, and so our team basically got together with Actis and did a management buyout. And so now we're you know, part of the Actis group, and so the name of the company now is Atlas Renewable Energy. This was a year ago when we finally consummated the transaction. Since then, I think we've been growing. I think so. We are present right now in 4 markets. So we have offices in Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Miami, and then we have projects also in Uruguay. And so far, I think it's been a great start to our business. I think we've been able to deliver all of the things that we said we would. We've been able to grow a lot more than what we expected to date. At the same time as doing all that, we had to kind of build the platform. So we had to hire, you know, a number of key positions that were missing, CFO, a couple of other key ones, and at the same time also sort of establish processes, procedures, you know, implement ERPs, things like that. So it's been a great first year for us. I think we're, again, as I mentioned before, I think we're now positioned to be the second largest solar company in the region, which is great. We're very excited about that, and I think we're, you know, very excited about the future. I think we see a lot of opportunities in the different markets we operate in, and so very excited so far.
Thanks. Definitely an ambitious project. Bryan, can you tell us a little bit? So my understanding is California's taken a pretty ambitious role in establishing international cooperation in this sector through initiatives like the Under 2 Coalition. Can you talk about how those efforts might be materializing into economic opportunities for the U.S.?
Well, that question might be a little better directed to the folks who actually, you know, work in business, since I am first and foremost a bureaucrat. But I will tell you that part of what California, part of what our message is, and why this is so important to Governor Brown, is it was a really big political lift in the very beginning in California to convince policymakers that we actually could decarbonize our economy overall, and specific in the energy sector, that we could get greater and greater penetrations of renewables while maintaining steady economic growth. And I think California has been at this for a number of years. we're about to hit our original AB32 goal of achieving 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we have another huge goal ahead of us, which is a 40% reduction by 2030, and then it kind of drops off the cliff and goes to an 80% reduction by 2050. And we've been doing this through a variety of sources, but actually no part of the economy has contributed to our decarbonization greater than the power sector. And so I think that's why our work with other governments, specific to the power sector, is so important, because we've really proved here in California that you can decarbonize and grow the economy. And obviously California is a wealthy state, and the gamble is a little less severe, in terms of enacting these policies, since we're starting from a higher place. But that's really, I think, what the administration is trying to get at in disseminating this knowledge. That because that same fear obviously exists in legislatures across the world.
The current administration obviously has some different views on climate and renewable energy than prior administrations, which is in some ways changing California's role on the international stage. California as a state was represented in the climate negotiations alongside countries. Is that changing your relationship with California as a state? How is that changing your investments and work?
I view this very much as a technology pull, if you will. This is market-based, and I don't really think that California or policy is really having much of an effect. It's just basically, it's market-based. The other area that we really haven't touched on that does contribute to pollution is, of course, the biofuels or continuing use of combustion of oil and gas and so on. And there is an effort going on. If you've been in any of these cities, you recognize that there's a significant amount of pollution caused by internal combustion engines, and they're also trying to address that in a number of different ways, and that's partly, that gets driven by California.
And as long as you touched on transportation, are you seeing significant uptick of EVs in the region, and how is that changing the grid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one area that so far very limited, so that's not penetrating yet. I think there's many differences with the U.S. system than the different systems you have in the different countries in Latin America. So here, you're a bit closer to this smart grid world, right? Where you can charge your cars in your house, and also conserve maybe as storage, right, for the grid. Maybe we're not there yet here, but we're a lot closer. I think Latin America, that's something that just is maybe 10 years away, or maybe not 10, but certainly not less than 5. So I think it's got a ways to go. As to your other question, I really agree. I think the driver for investment in Latin America, I think the current policy of the federal government here is having sort of zero effect. I don't think it matters at all. And I think what you're also seeing is some states like California are actually collaborating with states in Mexico, for example, to help them modernize perhaps their grid systems and their understanding of it. So I don't think it's also limiting some collaboration happening as well.
Yeah, we have here at UCLA, actually, our Smart Grid Research Center is doing exactly the kind of work you're talking about with vehicle grid integration, and we have a microgrid that's solar, battery, EV. But when I was down in Argentina, I met a designer down there with Bravo Motor Company who had a vision for creating integrated solar charging stations for EV. And they're now partnering with California, so I'm not sure what success they've had in their home country of Argentina. But are you seeing any of that? And is any of the solar development tied to electric vehicle charging, or really there's just still a gap?
Yeah, to date, I would say very little, so nothing material. I think you're starting to see more solar penetration on rooftops. I mean, certainly in Brazil, in Mexico, maybe Chile as well. Those are probably the 3 leaders in that sense. But that's sort of 3 steps behind what you're talking about with cars and integration of that nature.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of electric vehicles, I mean, Well, going back to the power industry, it's totally true that utility scale renewables, I mean, it's the cheapest game in town now. So the market is pushing us in that direction, which is absolutely incredible. And a huge reason why the power sector has been able to decarbonize so rapidly in California. EVs aren't quite there. Transportation, we have a roadmap in order to get us there in California, but that's really kind of pushing the grid of the future in terms of being able to actually have load management, being able to use buildings in the same way as a battery, in terms of being able to have demand response, cool buildings when the electricity is abundant and cheap and carbon neutral. So these are policies that we're striving for in California, and I hope that we'll be able to get it right and be able to share. But I will say with this administration, the demand on the California Energy Commission has definitely increased, and I hope that we're projecting, since we used to have a valuable partner in the State Department in terms of disseminating knowledge about programs in the clean energy space, and that's sort of dropped off or has gone sort of rogue in terms of the help we do get. And so we have definitely seen an uptick, and I hope that we're projecting some confidence that the U.S. will continue to be a stable partner in that arena. And I should note actually that one of Governor Brown's outgoing legacy accomplishments will be convening in San Francisco in September, a global climate action summit, which we're really hoping to poise as a next big forum in terms of decarbonization globally.
Definitely. We've talked a fair amount about solar and wind, et cetera, and here in California and everywhere. Big part of what makes this all work is storage. What kind of innovation are you seeing in Latin America around storage? What kind of adoption for any of you?
Yeah, I can start. I think that's one of the key areas that we need to do a lot more. So that's something that's just not happening. So I think we were just having this conversation with Brian before, people talk about batteries as like, this is going to solve everything. And I think there's you have to kind of break that down into what is batteries actually doing for you. So I think there's certainly a piece around storage, right, of energy, when solar is not shining, when sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing, you need a backup source, right? And so there's that point. But actually what's limiting us right now in Latin America in terms of, grid integration and increasing the penetration is not that. It's just the integrating to the grid. You sometimes have voltage and frequency, alterations, and that's actually, technology exists already today to fix that. So it's nothing complicated to fix. But some of the grid systems in Latin America have not thought ahead necessarily and planned adequately for that. So I think by fixing that, I think you will already allow a huge new penetration of renewables into the system. And then by the time we get to the issue of, well, do we need a backup solution that maybe doesn't exist today, or is the backup solution that's not flexible enough to accommodate this, then maybe by then you'll have storage systems that are a lot cheaper in terms of batteries. So I kind of see the evolution going that way.
Anybody down there doing any sort of power to gas yet as a sort of not quite storage, but different solution for excess solar?
As of now, I have not seen anything, no.
Just curious. I want to make sure we have time for more of a conversation, so we'll take some questions from the audience, and then if there aren't enough, I have lots more. So,
how does the new energy reform in Mexico affect your organizations and your investments?
That's a complicated question. The energy reform in Mexico privatized the market. So you have this auction system, and those auctions, there have been 2 or 3 now. They've been successful. The prices are incredibly cheap. Those projects will get built, but it's a very different market than the one we were originally looking at. We can't compete in that market. The return is just not simply there. On the private side, Carlos is right. There are lots of companies down there that are contracting to build projects, and those are happening, and they're happening with great regularity. And this guy is really the leader down there in creating a private equity marketplace for investing in that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Mexico reform, you got to separate the oil and gas reform with the power reform. So I won't comment on the oil and gas. I don't know enough about it. But on the power side, I think it's been extremely successful. Extremely successful. I think it's been very well thought out. It's a very complicated market right now, the way it works. But what they've tried to do is create a set of regulations that through market mechanisms incentivize investment in sort of different parts of Mexico. And as Lee said, I mean, I think as part of that, you've had, also rolled into it these long-term auctions, which have been incredibly successful for the government.
Wow.
So it's at the really early stages, right, of the reform. So they're still privatizing parts of CFE. They're still doing many, many things. But I would say it started very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the, I have to give a lot of credit to CAISO, the California grid operator, for helping share knowledge and setting up the market system there. And, so for example, in California, access to utility data is really, really important as we talk about storage and we talk about using buildings as storage and talk about decarbonizing in a least cost manner. And so I think that's sort of like the next cutting edge area. We've made a huge multi-billion-dollar investment in advanced meter infrastructure here in California, and we're trying to prove that that was a worthy investment and one that can provide a lot of the functions that are not analogous to batteries, to the rest of the world, and we'll have to see.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for being here. Also a student here at UCLA Anderson, Jorge Alvarez from Mexico. And my question relates to trying to link your comments to Professor Sebastian Edwards' presentation. Energy is a key enabler for economic development. How does investment in Latin America, and how does Latin America rank in the world in that regard? And is it moving faster than its peers, or how do you see it?
Does anyone know? You don't have to.
That's a tough question. I think it kind of depends. You have to break that down a bit, right? So, if you look at emerging market countries, right? The big sort of places where you have a lot of renewable investment, right, is India, Latin America, and China. Although China is mostly local, right? There are some in Southeast Asia, but not necessarily as much. I would say from an emerging markets country perspective, it has been a very successful story. I think you have seen a lot of investment go in. I think a lot of investors are more comfortable with the risks of political risk, et cetera, of Latin America compared to, for example, Africa. And so there's been a lot more penetration and a lot more just capital, right, flowing into Latin America versus some of these other geographies. So I'm not sure what the numbers are, but I would say it's been very successful, comparatively.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Natalie Hoffman. I'm an Anderson grad. I do business in Brazil primarily. There's a lot of opportunity for renewables there of every kind, renewable transportation fuels, bioelectricity, et cetera. To your point, Lee, about the stable currency issue for you in your projects, we all know that the Brazilian currency is not stable at all. Has there been any thought to using cryptocurrency for funding these projects and for getting revenue back?
Way beyond my pay grade.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge.
Well, I think that's something that could help with the currency issue.
So there is a currency that, or I'm not sure what I would call it, but there is a company that's trying to do something similar, like a blockchain type thing for solar projects. It would operate more like a voluntary emissions reductions credit, right? So you're selling your energy, and it would just be something that you would get in addition to whatever revenue you're getting. But it's not at all mainstream. It's not at all evolved, I think. It's still very early stage.
Do you know what the name of the company is?
Forgot the name of the company now.
Sorry.
Do you
No
see it as
problem.
a possibility, Carlos, as things develop?
I don't think anytime soon, no. I think most investors will not invest in that. It's not investable. I think it would be very difficult, but maybe over time. Huh? Maybe over time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about your opinion on tidal energy. We hear a lot about solar and wind energy, and I've done some research on tidal. I'm just curious on your opinion.
From my perspective, having looked at it for probably 25 years, it's still not cost competitive with wind and solar.
Everyone agree pretty much? I think so.
I mean, I think there's a lot of technologies like Tidal, and there's many, many others that are kind of being tested and sort of analyzed and researched. But I think few of them have, evolved to being something mainstream and that there's serious capital behind it. I think it's in that situation. So I think it needs a lot more time before that happens.
Hi, my name is Pablo. I'm a first-year student. I'm from Chile. I was looking for these projects, and as you said, at that moment we were worried about what happened with the prices and the oversupply. But also another thing that we were worried was about how was going the capex investment per megawatt, how was going down, so we didn't know which was the correct moment to enter. I wanted to ask you which moment do you think that is the bottom, or how do you expect that this investment or the capex which is the bottom?
If they knew that.
It's $8. No, I'm just kidding. I think wind and solar, the projection is it'll continue to come down. I think, it's now not dropping like this necessarily, it's more like this. How far will that continue? I think it's tough to say, but I think what most investors, what most businesses look to do is, sort of contract their projects on a long-term basis, right? So that they're not exposed to, well, all of a sudden the prices came down, and I mean, yeah, but you're contracted. So you've made your investment, you have your business case made 15, 20 years, whatever it is, and you're protected against that. So I think that's how most investors see it. Now, from government's perspective, or if you're a Coca-Cola or something, you're looking to buy energy, and you're saying, look, maybe I should wait 2 years till it comes down more. I think there's a lot of people in that camp. So I think that's tougher to say.
Brian, would you agree with that? From the
Yeah,
government
we've been talking a lot about utility scale renewables, and one of the things that has also been very important in California in our relationship with Mexico is figuring out a rate structure that adequately rewards homeowners for adoption of rooftop solar. So that's something that we worked a lot with Cray on, and that of course has its whole host of issues associated with operating the grid, but is incredibly important. And then one thing I did want to mention, which we've spent a lot of time working with, is ensuring obviously that the benefits of these decarbonization technologies are not only afforded to the most affluent. The thing about energy is it's of course a market, but it's also sort of a right, and we really have an obligation to ensure that that low income and that disadvantaged communities have access to clean energy. So that's can be a complicated area. It's not always like a cost-effective area, but figuring out the right mix of policies to ensure adoption of those technologies in those communities. And of course, energy efficiency has a huge leg up, as it is not just a means of reducing the need to purchase renewables, whether it be utility scale or rooftop, but it also improves lives, improves indoor air quality, improves productivity, and really takes on a life of its own, for example, in terms of the ability to garner increased rent, in like Class A buildings, for example. And,
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
LA is starting a CCA. Do we see any of that kind of, community aggregation work happening down in Latin America, or is it all pretty traditional grid utility models?
Generally, it's a traditional utility model or a private off-taker. There are some sort of venture-backed, because the grid hasn't penetrated particularly many areas in Central America, so there's a number of activities going on to do decentralized energy, whether it's a solar on a rooftop with a little battery inside that's got 4 ports for lights and a cell phone charger, and then you go and buy either a day or a week or a month's worth, and they give it away free. And there's a number of very interesting little models which are beginning to penetrate in some of these lesser developed areas where the grid's simply never going to get there.
Right.
And it's cost competitive with either charcoal or wood or whatever else they're burning, and so you have lots of benefits.
And so in that way, do you see, the title of the panel mentioned inclusive growth. Do you see that leapfrogging of renewables, really being an opportunity to address poverty in the region and close that gap or have more equitable distribution of electricity?
There are certainly some very interesting efforts going on to do that, yes.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, rural electrification efforts in Peru, for example, the government's been very active, I think, trying to find solutions for different communities they have in different parts of the country. I think the penetration hasn't been that big. I think I've seen more of it in other continents, maybe. I think there's a lot more there that can be done. And it's a case of focusing more on it, and governments actually actively seeking that out.
Thanks. So I want to wrap us up in time for the 4:15 panel, but do any of you have closing remarks you'd like to share with our students, alumni, others who are either already doing business in the region or interested in this renewables space?
I mean, I think one of the comments I was saying to somebody in lunch is, from an industry perspective, right? I mean, some of you are now going to go find jobs. And I think this industry, this sector in general of renewables, I think has a very interesting, couple of decades ahead. I think there's literally an energy revolution that's underway. Some people are sort of ahead of the curve. Some people are behind the curve. Some of the utilities haven't yet figured out what's coming. And there's going to be a lot of space for a lot of business models, innovation, new things that will emerge. So I would just say it's a really interesting space to be in right now.
Great. Lee?
I would encourage, and it's nice to hear many of you from the region, there are great opportunities and you should go and explore them. New business models that I think will catch on very quickly because there's a huge demand.
Bryan?
I would
Closing
second the comments of Carlos. I mean, this is a very innovative, fun, and disruptive time to be working within energy policy. You mentioned CCAs. The regulatory structure, even within California, has become incredibly complex. And at the same time, there are huge opportunities for data and for load management, energy efficiency. So just actively encourage you to consider the space.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to second or third that. I think all of you who are getting out into this space, climate change is a major challenge that we're trying to solve, and there's not one type of business professional that can contribute. These large companies need people in, business development or sales or, supply chain, and so whatever your background, if you care about these issues, there are ways of getting engaged. Definitely need entrepreneurs, so I hope some of you will consider that. Well, I want to thank our distinguished panel for bringing all this great experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.